The disturbing truth about the Afrikaner refugees in the United States first, an arrival that felt like a rebuke. Dulles International rarely pauses for anything, yet on the rainy morning of 12th of May 2025, even jaded ground crews stared as 59 white South Africans, starched shirts, miniature US flags, hymn books tucked in carry-ons, filed past immigration. They were the first beneficiaries of a brand new refugee track created by President Donald Trump's executive order and tailored almost exclusively for Afrikaners, the Dutch-speaking descendants of colonial settlers. While the wider U.S. refugee program remains frozen, this cohort entered on fast-tracked humanitarian visas stamped persecution on account of race. BBC, The Washington Post, their arrival landed like a diplomatic grenade in Johannesburg. President Cyril Ramaphosa denounced them as cowards running from nation-building, while protesters in Pretoria waved placards reading "Stop Trump's Fake Genocide." The Times of India inside America, refugee advocates asked a blunter question. Why was the White House bending asylum rules for one of the world's wealthiest, statistically safest minorities, while Afghans, Sudanese, and Rohingya still languished in visa limbo? 2. The myth that powered an executive order. Trump justified the carve-out by declaring a white genocide in South Africa, echoing talking points long circulated in alt-right forums and amplified by billionaire Elon Musk. Yet every credible homicide database shows farm murder rates have fallen since 2017 and remain lower than South Africa's urban murder average. BBC fact-checkers reviewing autopsy reports and docket numbers concluded that talk of genocide is imaginary. See, the State Department's own 2024 Human Rights Report notes that Afrikaners still dominate commercial agriculture and hold disproportionate land wealth. But within MAGA media ecosystems, grisly images of farm killings, often recycled or misdated, spun a horror narrative powerful enough to override empirical nuance. A refugee pipeline built in the shadows, NPR unearthed the internal mechanics of the program. An expedited group designation that bypasses the United Nations vetting channel and routes applicants through private contractors hired by the Heritage Foundation's legal aid arm. NPR case files were processed in under 6 weeks, warp speed compared with the 18 to 24-month slog Iraqis and Central Americans face even after passing background checks. Selectees did not come from refugee camps. Most flew business class from Johannesburg. One immigration lawyer who reviewed affidavits says the bulk of the persecution narratives rely on anonymous WhatsApp threats or headlines about land reform bills, not on documented attacks. In asylum law, we call that speculative fear, she notes. Until now, it almost never met the bar. The Switzerlander connection and stateside militancy scratch the surface of the new arrivals support network, and a darker ecosystem appears. Several sponsors are linked to the Switzerlanders, a South African survivalist movement preparing for a race war. The group has long courted U.S. militias. Its spokesperson did a fundraising tour through Texas and Idaho in 2017, and South African police last year raided a Limpopo firearms camp credited to the same network. Counter-extremism researchers worry that transplanting those cadres into an American landscape already seeded with Proud Boys chapters and accelerationist cells is combustible. You now have combat-trained ideologues entering communities where AR-15s are easier to buy than cough syrup, warns Jacob Ware of the Council on Foreign Relations, who has tracked transnational white supremacist militancy for years. 5. Security vetting or the lack of it. Homeland Security officials, speaking on condition of anonymity, admit the policy's rush left gaping holes. U.S. background checks can query Interpol Red Notice databases, but South Africa rarely flags domestic hate crime suspects. A 2024 Pretoria court file lists one new refugee, now living in Knoxville, as a former member of an illegal paramilitary commando. Because the indictment was sealed in Gauteng, it never reached U.S. biometric screens. The FBI quietly opened a task force dubbed Boer Watch to map arrivals against extremist chatter on Telegram, senior law enforcement sources confirm. We're not pretending every Afrikaner is a threat, one analyst says, but if even a handful were radicalized, we just imported that risk. 6. Collateral damage. Who got shut out while Afrikaners step into furnished apartments in Virginia and Tennessee? Tens of thousands of Congolese refugees, already approved by the UN, remain stuck since Trump's January freeze. Yes, the International Rescue Committee projects a 57% shortfall in global resettlement slots this fiscal year because the White House diverted processing staff to the Afrikaner corridor. All refugee ceilings are zero-sum, argues IRC Policy Director Amanda Catanzano. Every expedited case for a well-connected farmer means a Yemeni widow waits another year in Aden. From culture shock to culture war on Telegram and X, U.S. far-right influencers hailed the newcomers as proof that white Europeans remain welcome. Fundraisers branded Adopt a Boer solicit tractor donations and Patreon subscriptions. Some arrivals quickly echoed the rhetoric. Interviewed by BBC in Virginia, 34-year-old Peter Kleinhaus acknowledged South Africa's farm murder rate was statistically minor, but said, "I won't be a victim. They threatened to take my land." Civil rights groups fear a propaganda feedback loop. Afrikaner testimonies nourish U.S. conspiracies about demographic displacement. American extremists then amplify those stories back into South African politics, fueling the very paranoia that spurred the exodus. 8. Legal storm clouds. The executive order already faces 2 lawsuits, one from the American Civil Liberties Union for racial discrimination, another from asylum seekers of color who argue equal protection violations. Plaintiffs cite Trump's own remarks that the program was designed to help people who look like the founders of our country. Civil rights lawyers liken it to the 1920s Nordic quotas dressed in humanitarian clothing. Immigration judges may also balk. Past Afrikaner asylum bids were routinely denied on grounds that state discrimination does not equal persecution. Several DOJ veterans privately predict a courtroom bloodbath once the applicants confront the evidentiary threshold. South Africa's official crime data lists 6,059 murders in 2024. Only 61 victims were white farmers. Land reform legislation has moved glacially. Fewer than 400 farms transferred under expropriation clauses since 2018. Meanwhile, Afrikaner median household wealth still surpasses Black South Africans by a factor of 9. Those figures do not negate fear, but they discredit apocalypse rhetoric. Congressional Democrats vow to use budget riders to defund the Afrikaner channel. House Republicans threaten impeachment if they do. Pretoria, insulted, mulls a tit-for-tat visa requirement for U.S. diplomats. Analysts warn the fiasco could torpedo South Africa's G20 summit later this year, an event Trump now says he might boycott over human rights concerns. For the refugees themselves, the American dream already shows fissures. Some struggle with credit histories or licensing for their veterinary degrees. Others lament that suburban HOA rules forbid the high perimeter fences they consider basic security. Yet many confess relief. Petrol is cheaper, taxes lower, firearms plentiful. Whether the experiment becomes a humanitarian scandal or a benign demographic footnote may hinge on a single variable. Does the small minority of radicalized arrivals find new oxygen in America's partisan oxygen barn, or does the melting pot cool them down? Refugee resettlement was designed for those fleeing indiscriminate war or state pogroms. By fast-tracking a politically favored, comparatively privileged group on evidentiary claims experts debunk, the United States has warped that ethic and may have imported a security headache in the process. If precedent holds, future administrations from either party could cherry-pick refugees to score ideological points, eroding global norms that already hang by a thread. Decades from now, we may look back on the Afrikaner airlift not as an act of mercy, but as the moment American asylum policy surrendered to culture war theatrics, proof that in a hyper-polarized world, even refuge can become a weapon.